really important that you understand if it's yours, you are the one to pay for the repairman to come out. Okay? So he has to provide trash receptacles if 4 or more units. So if it's over 4, he has to get a dumpster. If it's under 4, he has to supply you with a garbage can and have everything removed to the curb at garbage day. Sometimes he pays a tenant in the building to do it. So a lot of people kind of get like a reduction of their rent to do that or something like that. So he is to return the security, maintain buildings, common areas, which is the hallways and anything like the laundry rooms. Those are common areas. That is the landlord's duty to keep it clean and safe. So if there's any homeless people living down there, it is his job to get them out of there. Call the police, get them out of there. So he is to return security deposit within 30 days minus the repairs. So he gets 30 days to give you your security deposit back if you gave a forwarding address. If you don't give a forwarding address, he will not give it back. He doesn't have to by law because he don't know where to give it to. It's real important that you give a forwarding address with the keys, okay? Make sure the keys are turned in on the day that you say that they're going to turn in. Okay, you can put. Okay, the escrow process. If the landlord won't repair something, withholding your rent will do nothing but get you evicted. You cannot call not one council member, home, person, me, can't help. Pay the rent. Pay the rent, then we fight. But if the rent is not paid, 3 days. And there's almost nothing we could do but help you get rental assistance. Just try and talk to the landlord. Hey, if she could pay so much, on her rent for next month to get caught up. Sometimes they'll do a mediation on that, and sometimes they won't. But if you withhold the rent on purpose because you're upset, that is the wrong thing to do. It's very important that you understand nobody can help if you hold your rent. It takes 30 days to put your rent in an escrow process. You have to give him a 30-day letter stating, hey, you need to fix this, you need to fix this, and you need to fix this in 30 days. If you don't give them that letter and you go down there and put it in escrow, they're going to ask you for that letter. They won't let you do it. It's illegal. He could go down there and have a release if you do get a clerk that don't know that you need that 30-day notice. He'll just go up and say, hey, I didn't get it, and they have to release your money. So now you're right back in that cycle all over again. You can call the health department, though, and they will come out and put orders on him. That's before the escrow process, okay? Which we talked about, make sure he gets that letter. And if repairs are not made in 30 days, take a copy of it down to the local courthouse on down Main Street, room 115, and the clerk will walk right through it. Just make sure you have the landlord's name, address, and where you pay your rent. Okay? Then we serve the landlord, which is like a reverse type. That's kind of nice to have the landlord server. So that's kind of cool. So then you'll have an escrow court. Escrow is a court. So remember, courts are about evidence, right? Pictures. Take pictures of your repair. Say he's not doing it. If you see rats coming in, take a picture. Take a picture of the hole you see in the wall, okay? It's really important that's your evidence. Okay, so rent money must be received on time at the courthouse. That's very important, guys. If your lease says that your rent is by the 5th, you have to the 5th to go down to the clerk's office and pay that rent. So it has to be paid in cash. Not with your Visa card. Make sure you have your money in cash. Okay? If you're a day late, everything starts all over. It has to be on time. So that's why we say don't hold your rent, because even the court wants to come out. It's really important. Okay, so after filing the thing will be notified as time and date of the court mediation. So usually the court tries to do a mediation with both of you first, just to stop everything. Okay, if we can show hardship and you can't fix it, guess what? We can abate it and then we can get you out from the deal. And then we can use maybe some type of rental assistance, some other resources to help move forward. But if you can show we can't repair it, then we got a problem. And we can't have small kids in a home that's water that don't run or something like that. Okay, so, but you will receive, the tenant will receive a notice, you'll go to court, you'll have your picture, subscribers and your video, right? So it's really important that you have these things because that's the only way you can prove that these things happen. If you don't do it, then he has all the glory, right? It's really important that you don't do that. So the court will legally withhold the rent from the landlord if you did it properly. You'll withhold it in the repairs. So say weeks go by, a month goes by, and your repairs is not still, it's not happening. You can go back to the escrow court and you can actually ask for a court date. He has to come back to court and we have to figure out why aren't you doing repairs. Okay? So you can also negotiate your lease. Say that you've just been there like 6 months. So now we're gonna negotiate your lease. Let's put some fines on the landlord. You owe me 6 weeks of a lease that we find at ourselves for a whole year, right? He would do it to you, you have the right to do it back. So tenants, they don't have the right, but they do. So that's when you're gonna go and you're gonna file a small claims for it. And then you can ask for double of what you're renting. Only up to 5,000, but 5,000 is pretty cool, right? Better than getting nothing back. Okay. So that's good. Okay.
With the text, is that not in writing?
Yes. And it can actually flow up, not for escrow.
Right.
The letter is on back of a packet that we can always send you, email you. There's an actual escrow packet. It has the letter and everything on that. It has to be a written notice. It cannot be a text. Yeah, you can use text for court if you print it out. If you go to court with your phone, no. But if you go to the library across the street first, yep. Pay it down, you can print it out. Now they turn it into a document, right?
We work at the courthouse, we know you cannot turn your phone.
No, they don't like your phone. They don't like your phone unless it's a video, where it has pictures and it's showing, that this has happened. But some magistrates cannot stand phones because, of course, they're just like a magnet for germs. So unless you can print things out, it's really important to have a printout at the library. Okay. Tenant responsibility. Tenants are responsible to comply with applicable tenant housing, health, safety codes. Allow landlord to enter for inspections or repair when given proper notice, which is the 24-hour letter, written, not, you can text, now that you can text. That is written, because you can print it out and say it. So he needs to give you that. And so that you can plan around your day. He does not have to. Anything missing, that's how you do it, but he can. Okay? So he is a good operator. All he does is fixtures problem. That is important. If you get an updated Samsung, whatever, so do a training for landlord so you don't break the property. Because if you break it, guess what? So do a training is really, really important. Keep all premises safe and sanitary. So yeah, we're not. So I think we have an inspection. We're not. It's really important. It cannot intentionally or negligently destroy damaged property at supply fixtures and appliances. You pay. You destroy, you pay. That's all there is to say about it. That goes for the toilet. That goes for anything your kids put a hole in the wall. If you and your guest, your mother-in-law, you have an argument with your boyfriend, if you can, you pay. So the landlord will be the plumber out there. And he will give you some kind of all that. And he's going to tell you. So now it's not a separate bill, right? It's a bill that he wants you to pay with rent. So now we got to pay this tax. So we have a little thing, I have a little flag on there about mediation. So a lot of times what we call us is mediation, we'll set it up. We'll go in and say, it will break us $10 each one. But if you mess up that plan, guess what? Right back to the start. So be careful, always speak up. If you need help, speak up. There's a lot of resources down here for you. guys, so please speak up and say, hey, I can't pay. So, okay, let's do a mediation fee, $5. Because our goal is going $2. Call me and you got a $2 bill. I will do anything to help you. So just make sure that you call me before you get to me. That's very important. Okay, so you cannot disturb neighbors, please enjoy the offenses. So that means keep your arguments down, keep your music down. Some people are very, they're very sensitive. Sometimes we have thin walls. I'm not saying you have to whisper or tiptoe, but you need to keep your music down. And anything after, like I said, 8 or 9 o'clock, be mindful that you have neighbors. Be mindful that your kids are running up and down the hallway, because that's what kids do. But if they have a bedtime, then that helps the neighbor that's, below you about 8. And just the doors after 8 o'clock or something. So then that's also a mediation that we can do if it's just to the point where you guys can't deal with each other, then we can do a mediation and see if the landlord can move one to another building or something like that. Okay? So non-payment of rent or drug or criminal activity will result in 3 days. Don't pay, 3 days. Criminal activity means smoking marijuana, fighting. A lot of premises they just have a hard policy against fighting. So say some girls come to your apartment fighting you. Call the police. Don't get out there and start fighting them back. If they come close enough to hit you, just don't do that. Try to go back in the house and call the police so that it looks like it's one them and not you. They're not your guests, so you're not responsible. But it can be the other way around. So if it's your guest, then say, what? You guys are fine when you walked out. But he got to his car and another guy came up to him and all of a sudden they start fighting with your guest. So guess what? They're coming to you. Okay, so be real careful about your guests. Walk up to the door. Say, don't worry about it, let them go, but it's fun. Evictions. The landlord must give you a written notice to the tenant, and this has to be written. But he could put it on. He could roll it up like this and put it between your knob. Okay? He could put it over, like, he can stick it in the mailbox like this. If you have to know the mailbox that's made out. Some people get really upset because when you post it, it's showing their business. It does. But there's nothing that we can do is he has to get that notice. And he can't chase you around to get it. So he has a right to do that. So in most cases, the landlord must give a 30-day notice to vacate the property, except non-payment of rent and drugs. You keep coming back to that same 3 days. 3 days, people, 3. Not 33. So you have to understand that there's a difference. So we keep coming back to no rent paid. No rent paid, you gotta go. So it's really difficult to get that in there. So I always want to do an exception there. The court summons will be mailed to you or served to the tenant in 5 days. So say the landlord say, hey, if you leave in 3 days, then I won't evict you. Do you believe him? So you can't trust that, because you still owe him money, right? He's gonna go get that money. So you leave in 3 days, you missed the court paper that came to your house. So how do you know when your court date is? Well, you can always pull up public record. Whatever county you're in, Hamilton County Clerk of Courts, put your name in, search records, put your name in. And it will show you that not only did he get you out his property in 3 days, he's still going to charge you money for what you owe him. If you're in a lease, or you didn't give him the 30-day notice, guess what? He get 30 days plus more, because the notice wasn't properly given. So, any questions about that? I know it's a little confusing, but no? Okay, that's good. All right, so for month-to-month leases, landlord and tenant may end tenancy by giving 30 days. You can do the same to the landlord. You live for the month you pay. So say you pay in October, but you're moving to Atlanta coming up. You have to give him the 30-day notice in the month that you pay rent. So we're in October, you already paid your rent. You need to give him any day in October and say you're going to be out in November 30th. Last day of the month, round it off. There's no proration going out only coming in. Unless you and the landlord agree, you can leave on the 18th. But the law says that the tenant must stay and pay 30 days. So say you pay, but you left. So does he say you abandoned it now? Did you leave things behind? Did you return the keys? There's a lot to go through you leaving. You need to set up something with him to return the keys. Okay? So that's the eviction part. You can play. Retaliatory eviction. This is a little shaky, and some things on here are a little different, but the landlord cannot retaliate against a tenant by increasing the rent or decreasing services or evict the tenant from the premises. The tenant made a complaint to the appropriate city or county, like the health department or the building department. He cannot evict you for that. That's retaliation. So give us a call if he tries that. The tenant makes a general complaint to the landlord about violation of tenant rights. You have a right to speak up. You have a right to call any agency in this city that you feel is going to help you and your family in or out of the situation that you're in. He cannot retaliate to you about that. You could call Columbus. He can't retaliate. He cannot evict you. Okay, that's really, really important. The tenant joins or organizes or participates in a tenant union. It's always smart to get a tenant union in your building. I mean, you guys can do so much together because he plans on you guys being apart. If he can pick you up one by one on your rights instead of together, he cannot evict you for trying to join up with the neighbors and say, hey, this isn't right. We can't use the laundry room, and it's an amenity. So we need to get him to fix the laundry room, right? Fix the washers, fix the dryers. But you got to come together, and he can't do anything about that. Okay, so if he does, if he has been found to have retaliated for any above reasons, the tenant may recover actual damages and attorney fees. So you can file, okay? You could call, if it gets to the point where it's retaliation and he locks out, legal aid will jump in, and they will actually take your case, okay? And you can win a lot of money that way too. So the landlord doesn't always win, guys. You just have to know your rights. But he doesn't always win. The tenant can still be evicted if the rent is overdue. We're right back to the overdue. I said it nicely that way, But pay the rent, guys. It's the same words, right? Just kind of twisted a little bit. So if it's overdue, there are code violations caused by the renter or tenant's guest, we already talked about that, or visitor, or the unit is ordered for repairs or condemned. So if it's ordered to be condemned, everybody got to go. It's being condemned. So say you call the health department and the roof is falling in, everything's happening, the electric is out. If the health department or the building department come out and say it's abated, another word for unlivable, he has to bring it up to code. Now, condemned is another word. That's a different word. Condemned means it's going to be tore down. But if it's abated, that means it's unlivable. But if you live in the city of Cincinnati, they actually have a city relocation fund that can help, you going forward. You have Salvation Army that can put your family up for a night or two. So you have some choices there. But if it's abated, that means that it's beyond fixing it, and we don't want you guys in there unsafe. Okay? You can turn that.
Question on the tenant union. Does it have to be just one building, or could it be multiple buildings that the landlord owns, that all of those renters?
Oh, yeah. That's even more powerful. So it could be, a person from each building. It could be like 4 buildings and one person in one building. And if you guys know you're doing it, then bring all 4 of them together. So it's very powerful. You could go all the way up to Columbus and change no rent control. See? Okay, so security deposits. The tenant must give the landlord a forwarding address to get the security deposit. We already talked about that. He don't know where to give it if you don't give him an address. Give your mom, your sister, anybody's address. It doesn't have to be where you're moving, okay? Just so that he knows you're giving it. The landlord gets 30 days to return the security deposit minus damages. So he has 30 days to give you a letter stating, hey, your deposit was $600, but I'm gonna take $300 because the rug had red spots, or it just needs to be clean. Well, if it has red spots, that's a problem. I probably wouldn't fight it, pick your battles. But if it's just dirt, no, he has to get it moving ready for the next person. That's small claims. So see, we got courts here. We got the eviction court, we got small claims court, and we have escrow court. That's the Ohio courts for Ohio landlord-tenant law. You just got to know the difference. So anytime you want money back from the landlord, small claims. Anytime you want the landlord to drop some money off of you or a violation, small claims. Okay, escrow, no repairs. Eviction, I paid my rent and you just don't know it. You just didn't get the memo that I paid my rent. So those are the three courts that we're dealing with. So the landlord gets to return it minus the damages. If you don't agree with the damages on a letter, take your letter and go down there and file yourself a small claims. The magistrate will decide who's what. Take pictures. So when you move out, you're taking pictures and video, right? Always take pictures and that's your evidence. Clean the stove. It's really important. Those are not your appliances, and if they weren't given to you that way, you don't need to leave it that way. Clean it. Yeah, it's going to be spots from cooking. That's okay. Open it up, clean it. Okay? Clean the bathtub, take yourself a video, and now you got evidence for court. Real important. Okay? The security deposit may be used for reasonable wear and tear. 3 years. If you live there 3 years, that's reasonable wear and tear. So, he can get it if there's like Kool-Aid or gum in the rug. I mean, he can't move another person in there on that rug. So it's really important that you guys, teach your kids, don't do it. And then you can't always catch kids. But try some stuff. Go to YouTube. They have like when you freeze, like put ice on gum and it come up. It's just amazing to me. He can't move a tenant as long as he can't lock a tenant out or threaten unlawful acts such as, what is that saying? Shut off utilities in the unit. If he even thinks about shutting off the utilities, especially if you got little kids in there, call legal aid immediately. Legal aid, that is who you call for shutouts, lockouts. He has to have a court order. It's really important. We can't have them running rogue like that. And they will do it. Some of them don't know. They haven't been trained yet, and we're trying to train all the landlords too. Maurice will be helping us do that. So I do the tenants and educate you guys on how to communicate with the landlord, and he's going to teach the landlord how to communicate with you so that we can bring it all together and be happy, right? We live happy. Good. So let's see. So the lockout of any shut off or utilities, the landlord could only evict during a court hearing with a lawful court order. Very, very important. And he risks liability. So say he puts your things out and those were pictures of my baby, those were birth certificates, and you were at work. Those are really high risk. Liability, go get a real attorney. You can actually foul on him. If you come home and things are out in the yard, take a picture. If y'all notice, I like to say picture and video because that's the tenant, that is your weapon. So please try and just take that for yourself and always have yourself ready. Get a folder also. Anything the landlord gives you, put it in your folder. Don't throw it on the counter or in the drawer because now when I call you and say, hey, could you email me that letter so that I could call him and fight for you? I don't know where it's at. I need you to know because I'm going to ask you to email me stuff. Can you email me the lease? If you don't understand that part, call me so that we can go through it together and then I can explain it to the landlord and say, hey, you can't do that to them. So Keep a folder, it's very, very important. Is that the end of my thing?
Last one is even after legal action.
That was it?
No right to keep the property, even after the legalization, the last one was.
Oh, even at the legal eviction, the landlord has no right to keep the tenant's property. So that's why I was going back to Butler County, right? They put it in a truck, but that's because the ordinance said if they put it on the curb, they are responsible for the payment. So they're not gonna put it, but Hamilton County don't do that. If you live in Hamilton County, they have to put it to the curb. You could be standing there with your truck, but I do have to let you know that if somebody's walking down the street, they can help you take it to their car. They will take it if they can, so. Any other questions, guys? No, everybody good? Well, that's great. Thank you. Yep.
We'll spend the rest of the time just a little bit talking about fair housing. So it's important you know about tenant rights, but fair housing really is the protection that you have against discrimination and illegal housing discrimination. So, we talk about, it's the law, but it's also important because it's about our nation's founding principles of freedom and justice. You have the right to live where you want to live, the freedom to choose that, and you can't be discriminated against in where you're choosing to live or where your family's choosing to live. We'll go through these pretty quickly. So the Federal Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. It covers all places. It's the federal law, and it protects against housing discrimination for 7 protected classes. So it's race, color, religion, national origin, which is where you're from or where your family's from, sex, gender, family status, which is if you have kids or are expecting kids, and disability. And we'll talk about some of these cases within each of the protected classes. The Fair Housing Act doesn't specifically protect against discrimination against sexual orientation and gender identity, but just in the last 2 years, HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and courts have started to say that sex-gender discrimination also protects against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity. So you can't, kind of under this interpretation, it's illegal to discriminate because someone's gay or because they're trans, that is now considered sex discrimination. Cincinnati does protect against sexual orientation and gender identity and marital status, as well as Appalachian origin. Ohio protects ancestry. I've never seen an ancestry case, but I think it's like kind of instead of where you're from, where your family's from, it's like who your family is, kind of what's your family lineage, as well as military status. I don't know if Norwood has any extra protections. If you don't have like a mechanism enforcing it either. So that's the other caveat, is that the Federal Fair Housing Act is enforced by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Ohio is enacted by the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. There's not necessarily a lot of enforcement options for the city of Cincinnati or city of Norwood, besides fines for landlords, kind of things you could do through the kind of the court process. Next slide, please. So the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in housing and housing-related transactions. So that includes any type of house, any type of dwelling is the legal term. So it's apartments, condos, houses, even student housing, dormitories, also emergent, like some shelters, transitional housing. So the exception is if it's a kind of a one-night only drop-in shelter, then that's not necessarily considered a dwelling. The other exemption is for owner-occupied homes that have 4 or fewer units. So Cincinnati has a lot of duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. If you live as the owner, you live in one of those units, the other 3 units you rent, then you're exempt from some of the fair housing protections. Not all of it. You can't discriminate on the basis of race or religion or gender, or race or color or national origin because of other civil rights laws, but you can have a little bit more discretion about disability, family status. So it's owner-occupied 4 or fewer units. And there's like asterisks there too. It depends on, you can't be making statements, you can't kind of have there's some other kind of liability there. The types of housing providers that are liable for fair housing are landlords, property manager, maintenance, any employee or agent of that landlord. And it's important to note for the landlords, anybody working on your behalf, you also have liability for their actions. So if the maintenance worker is saying something, that also kind of goes up the chain to the landlord, that the landlord's also liable for that discrimination. It applies to anybody that's related or involved with kind of housing transactions. So you think also about like occupancy permits and advertising and problem properties and kind of nuisance, like anybody enacting those kinds of things related to a house is liable for fair housing. Next slide, please. So housing discrimination looks like a lot of different things. We'll talk about a few different case examples for protected classes quickly. But we often from history think about signs that say, no blacks, or really explicit discrimination about I don't want these people in my home. We don't necessarily see a lot of that anymore. It does still exist. It also exists in other protected classes that we see a lot of no kids. That's kind of pretty blatant discrimination. So we see like refusal to rent or sell. So no, I don't want to rent to you. It doesn't necessarily happen like that. It happens with a smile. It happens, oh, I'm so sorry, we just rented that apartment to you. When in fact they did not rent the apartment. It is still available. That's why testing, that's why our investigation is really important. Because oftentimes you don't know that you've been discriminated against. Although sometimes you just have a weird feeling. You have this gut feeling like, that's so weird, I just talked to, or someone just told me that this became available, that should be available, what happened here? Then that's, something to call us about. There's also setting different terms and conditions. And so that would be applying rules differently based on a protected class, charging higher prices, charging more fees, putting more fines, putting more lease violations, kind of enacting the rules differently on a protected class, whether it's race, if someone has kids, if they have a disability, those setting different terms and conditions is another form of discrimination. Some terms from kind of history that may or may not still be happening, probably still impacting our community, are blockbusting, which is where realtors would come in and say, get out while you can, sell your house before those people move in. The realtor would say that to a mostly white community, would turn around, sell it to a black family at a much higher price. We don't see that very often anymore, although I think trends about, who's moving in, who's being solicited to move in, kind of heralds some of what's happening with these demographic changes in our community. Steering is a term that still happens a lot, where housing providers or landlords or real estate agents is most commonly kind of where this comes from, kind of makes determinations on where you might be more appropriate to live. So as a white female, you might want to look at homes in this neighborhood, or you might feel more comfortable over here. It doesn't just happen with real estate, it also happens with landlords. And the landlord might say, hey, this family might be more comfortable in one of this property. They have kids. Oh, they might be more comfortable on the first floor. You don't get to decide that as a landlord. The family gets to decide that. My old boss in St. Louis, Missouri, where I used to work, had an experience of this where he was an African-American female, or an African-American male. He applied to an apartment complex, and the property manager used a black colored pen to fill out his application. He realized that all the black families were living at the back of the complex, and that the manager would use a different color pen depending on the race of who was applying, so that they would know they would put the black families at the back of the building, the white families at the front of the building. This was before he got into fair housing. He didn't know about his rights, but there has been similar cases like that have settled for over $700,000 in Maryland for damages. So steering even within a property complex or steering to different units is a form of discrimination. Next slide, please. So a couple things that we continue to see around race, color, religion, even national origin discrimination is steering. So steering kind of people to different neighborhoods, different apartment complexes or units. Screening. So if you think about a screen, that's asking questions and filtering out kind of who is qualified. So some of the questionable questions that we get are, what form of documents can you qualify for? How much do you need to make to pay the rent for this? If certain people are being asked, okay, you need to make 4 times the rent, other people are only asked 3 times the rent, that would be considered difference in screening terms. We also see this about what kind of other documentation people need. I might be told, yes, your credit's going to be fine, I'm sure you can qualify for this apartment. Someone else that looks a different color might be said, well, you have to have this much credit score, I'm going to do a criminal background check, and you have to give me landlord references. Any kind of difference in that information about what qualifies you for an apartment is still forms of discrimination. Voice profiling, we do this, everybody does this, it's unconscious. You hear someone's voice, you see their name, and you automatically kind of place a race or nationality or ethnicity on someone's sound of their voice or their name. That we kind of put those racially identifiable things. And so it's really important to be conscious of that, and also be aware, if you're a housing provider, kind of what information you're giving people based on the sound of their voice. Our testing coordinator, other forms of kind of investigations are very conscious to use their white voice because they get told different information when they're just inquiring to see if there's an availability. And then redlining is a form that comes from, historically the federal government was involved in this practice where they drew lines around different neighborhoods saying the risk of that neighborhood and not allowing any home loans or home insurance. We still see the impact of that today where there are segregated parts of our community that don't have the same level of access to bank loans simply because of the race or composition of that neighborhood. National origin, this is again where you're from or where your family's from. The forms of discrimination we see are also voice profiling. If someone has an accent, they're told different information. The other big thing here is identification documents. So what documentation are people asking for around social security numbers, birth certificates, ID cards? Oftentimes we see Latinx families, other families from other countries being told very different information about what sort of documentation they have to provide. There was a very large recent case that was settled in Pennsylvania where the developer manager had the policy of requiring every adult on that lease to have a social security number. And that was found to be discriminatory because not everyone has a social security number here. There are people in the country legally that don't have a social security number. And that policy had the impact of restricting who had access to that property. And so those sort of ID requirements or documentation requirements are kind of a big issue with national origin discrimination. Next slide. Sex and gender. So sex discrimination, looks like typical discrimination, but the recent things are that sexual orientation and gender identity are now protected classes for the purposes of fair housing. So it's illegal to deny someone because they're gay or because they're gender nonconforming or because they're trans, that any of that kind of discrimination, even in private markets, is now considered illegal discrimination. We also see a lot of sex discrimination against domestic violence. And so survivors of domestic violence are hit with lease violations. They're hit with termination notices because of the actions of their abuser. That is a form of sex discrimination. There's a lot of extra protections if it's subsidized housing, but if the landlord is cracking down more harshly on survivors of domestic violence, that could be sex discrimination. An area of this that cities, and I would flag this for the city of Norwood, is that if you have a problem property ordinance or a criminal or nuisance ordinance where you're cracking down on properties that have problems or receive kind of too many complaints, too many calls for service, if there's no exemptions for domestic violence or other criminal activity because of domestic violence, that is also a form of housing discrimination, not just by the landlord, also by the city and how the city is enacting those kind of problem property ordinances. There's been lots of cases nationally where cities, I worked on a case in St. Louis where we sued a city because they had a no tolerance policy. If you called the police more than 2 times within a year, then the landlord had to evict that tenant, and the tenant was banned from living in that city. We represented survivors of domestic violence who were legitimately calling for help, got evicted, got banned from living in the city. That was found to be sex discrimination. Next slide, please. The other big area of sex discrimination these days is sexual harassment. There are a ton of sexual harassment cases these days. What we see is quid pro quo, which is this for that. I will fix your sink, I'll get you a new refrigerator, I'll give you a break on rent, I'll give you an allowance if you do this for me, usually if it's sexual in nature. Hostile environment is another one where it's comments, texts, pictures, coming into your apartment, anything that landlord does, a manager does, a maintenance worker does, that is sexual harassment. We've seen a lot of these kind of cases. Home has been involved in some major cases in Cincinnati where we represented 20 women that filed a case against a landlord, received close to $200,000 in damages. That landlord was barred from ever renting property or owning property again. There was also criminal charges. He was in jail for a while and lost kind of all property. So these are very big cases. They're hard cases to work on, but any kind of that action by a landlord, by anyone working in that property on behalf of the landlord is liable. Family status. So this covers families with kids under 18, pregnant women, as well as families attempting to gain custody of kids. What we see here, no kids. Landlords just say blatantly, no kids. Or they'll put different terms and conditions. They'll put harsher penalties. They'll hit families with lease violations. Okay, no scooters, no bikes anywhere on this property, or you're gonna kind of get a lease termination. Those kind of, burdensome rules or restrictions that impact what kids normally do would be family status discrimination.
I got a question. Are senior living places, are they exempt from?
Those are exempt from family status. Yep. We also see an issue here with occupancy limits. So generally, it's 2 people per bedroom. Landlords get into trouble if they start saying who sleeps in what bedroom. So if you're going to rent a 1-bedroom apartment to a couple, you better rent that to a single mom and her 12-year-old son. You don't get to decide what's appropriate or who sleeps where. That's the family's choice. If there are kids of different genders, then the family's allowed to decide kind of who sleeps in what bedroom. And the landlords get into trouble if they say, well, you need to get a 3-bedroom apartment if you're a couple and a boy and a girl kid, or dictating kind of who gets what bedroom. Landlords have gotten into trouble with that with the occupancy. It's generally 2 people per bedroom, although it really depends on the building inspection and the square footage. And then marketing. We see a lot of no kids, adult community, quiet community, all of that are red flags. You are allowed to say things like kids welcome or great for families. That kind of affirmative marketing is permitted. Next slide. All right, I could talk for like 5 hours on disability, but I won't. But we'll hit on a couple major points. Disability protections, this is the big one for fair housing. Most of our complaints are disability cases. There's a lot of broad protection. So disability is defined as anyone with a physical or mental impairment to one or more major life activities. It's anyone that has that impairment, anyone has a history of that impairment, or is perceived to have that impairment. Next slide, please. So any impairment to one of these major life functions, walking, breathing, sleeping, learning, working, moving, those are all kind of considered impairments. Next slide. There's lots of definitions or types of disabilities that are included. Lots of mental illness, other kind of impairments. Drug addiction and alcoholism are considered disabilities as long as someone is not currently using illegal substances. If they're currently using illegal substances, they're not considered to have a disability under the Fair Housing Act. So we have a couple recent cases. Most of our cases are about disability. A couple recent ones. One that I'll kind of mention is we had a client and her son who were receiving disability income, and the property manager said, no, that doesn't count as income. You have to make 3 times the rent, but we don't consider Social Security disability income, and everybody has to be working in this property. That was 2 instances of discrimination. One, you can't say everybody has to work because some people can't work because they have a disability. And 2, you can't kind of exclude disability income. That's a form of discrimination. That case, we've had a couple cases like that. One that just settled where the client got $13,500 in damages. They're changing their policies and receiving fair housing training. The other big area we see is failure to give reasonable accommodations. So a couple of our cases have been about, someone's requesting a reasonable accommodation and allowing a caregiver access to their apartment, to live in their apartment. They're not on the lease, they're not paying rent, but they're a round-the-clock caregiver for our client who has a disability, that has to be generally accommodated. We had a case like this where we did file a fair housing complaint and the property manager had to pay damages, receive training. Next slide. So reasonable accommodations, this is kind of the big category where people with disabilities are allowed to ask for changes in the policies or practices or procedures in order to allow them to fully enjoy their home. Next slide. So common examples, assistance animals. There's a lot of assistance animals. People with disabilities have a service animal, have an emotional support animal. The landlord generally doesn't allow pets, but they have to make an exception, generally have to make an exception if it's an assistance animal. But also things like giving additional time to move, assigning designated handicap parking spaces. We have a ton of these cases right now because generally the landlord doesn't assign parking spaces. If somebody has a mobility impairment, they cannot kind of park wherever. They are entitled to ask for a designated parking spot that's reserved for their unit. Generally, the housing provider has to give that. Next slide. So a modification, a reasonable modification, is any change to the physical structure of a building. So instead of changing policies, practices, modifications are things like adding ramps. I think that's on the next slide. Ramps, grab bars, lever door handles, kind of any physical changes. Reasonable accommodations, the landlord has to pay for. Reasonable modifications, the tenant has to pay for unless you receive federal subsidies. So generally in private housing, the tenant can get a modification. Yes, you can put in your ramp. You have to pay for it unless there's kind of federal funding involved. So how to ask for these accommodations or modifications? We generally advise people to put it in writing. You have to, unless a disability is readily apparent, you have to, or the landlord can ask to show verification of a disability and what that relationship is to what you're asking. So you have to show a verification letter from a medical provider, someone that knows the history of your disability, to say, yes, this person has a disability, this is what they're asking for, and there's that intersection between the two. So I have a mobility impairment, it's not maybe readily apparent, but I have a doctor's note to say, here's my mobility impairment, or here's, I have a disability that impairs my ability to walk long distances. I need a designated parking space in order to fully enjoy this home. My social worker, my psychologist gives me a letter saying, yes, I have been treating, been seeing this patient. She has a mental illness, and she needs her emotional support cat to alleviate those symptoms of her mental illness. That would be kind of documentation that a landlord could ask for. Next slide. A landlord cannot ask for, what's your diagnosis? How disabled are you? Those are all very discriminatory statements. They can't ask for medical records. And they can't charge fees for accommodations. So if you normally have pet rent, but you have an emotional support animal, your pet can't be, your support animal can't be charged pet rent. That is a reasonable accommodation. They're not a pet, it's an assistance animal. They can't charge a fee if, an accommodation is for my designated parking space. Any of those kind of changes, the landlord has to pay for those. Next slide. So we have a couple letters. I'm happy to send these out, or if you want examples of letters of how these should look like. But we really like to work with medical providers, doctors, social workers, anybody that is a credentialed professional to talk about how to write a good, reasonable accommodation letter, or a letter verifying kind of people's disabilities. We get lots of assistance animals, and so just quickly, you have to make exceptions if it's a no pet building. You can't be charged fees for those assistance animals. You can't have breed restrictions, so typically the landlord doesn't allow pit bulls, but somebody has a service animal that's a pit bull, they have to kind of allow that. They can't put numbers or limits on numbers of animals. As long as each of those animals have a reason that they're helping with someone's disability, then you have to allow that. Next slide. Then the Fair Housing Act also has 7 requirements for accessibility features. So buildings that were built after 1991, if it's a multifamily building, they have to be made accessible. Bare minimum accessibility. We still see a lot of these violations where large properties are still built without things like curb cuts, with things like thresholds, so someone has to kind of walk over a step. All of that would be violations of the accessibility requirements. Advertising, we talked a little bit about that. You can't be making discriminatory advertising. Harassment, if it's harassment because of any protected class, even if it's neighbor-on-neighbor harassment because of a protected class, maybe because of someone's religion or national origin, if the landlord knows about it and continues to let it happen, doesn't address the harassment, the landlord is liable for Fair Housing Act discrimination if it's because of a protected class. And then retaliation. If someone gets a lease termination or eviction because someone, complained or called home because of issues with fair housing, then that would be another kind of allegation or another complaint against the landlord for fair housing violations. Our agency helps people prepare their complaint. We'll help you file complaints. We file complaints with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. You have 1 year from the time of discrimination to file a complaint. You have up to 2 years to file in court. And there's our phone number. It's also listed on our brochures. Please give us a call with any questions or refer people to us. Any questions right now? Yeah.
You're good.
It's kind of a big question. Have you seen any successful programs or avenues where cities can support landlords to maintain their affordable housing? Like the landlord's just having an issue with this state regulation or whatever. Really a city working with the landlords to make sure that they don't lose that affordable housing because the landlord's just like, I'm done, I can't do this. Someone offered me a lot more money just to sell the property, or I can do this and up the rent.
That is a big question.
That's big.
I don't know any examples like off the top of my head. A lot comes down to money.
Yeah.
Money is a big incentive.
I know
So-
society's been doing some stuff, but like, it's not necessarily enforceable, right?
Right.
So then that's the issue. Trying to look at maybe like CRAs or things like that, but I mean, Norwood has a good amount of affordable housing right now, but we're losing it, and so just trying to be creative and what can we do to maintain it and also make sure it continues to be safe housing.
Yeah.
And I know everyone's dealing with it, but
Yeah. I mean, I think policies around, what tax abatements are you offering? What property tax relief? Kind of what other incentives can you give to landlords to maintain that? It all comes down to funding, but those kind of policies, I think, are right in line with what other cities are doing or thinking about.
okay, thank you.
Did you tell them about
Great.
this card?
So Janet passed out, if you're interested in being a tester for us, you can fill that out, give it back to us, or follow up with us. Happy to make our emails available too. Or Alexis knows how to get a hold of us. But thank you all so much for being here on a Wednesday evening, I don't know what day it is.
Right.
Wednesday evening, appreciate you coming out. Please do reach out, we're happy to help landlords and tenants.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.